Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast and thank you so much for tuning into this solo episode in which I want to talk to you about my 1 week trip to New York. I'm recording this on Monday, November 18th, so I've literally just come back because I went from the 8th to the 15th of November. And I thought I would release this episode immediately after the last 2 episodes with Brandon Da Cruz because we covered a lot of practical tips on how to stay on top of your fitness goals and particularly fat loss goals while you're traveling. And I think this would be a great opportunity to show you how you can apply all of those tips to your own individual circumstances by using myself as an applied example. Moreover, at this time of year, a lot of people are thinking about traveling or they're going to be having more meals out or social meals than usual because of the upcoming holidays, including Thanksgiving in the US, but also Christmas, New Year's, and so on. So I think it's just a timely opportunity for me to record this episode. First, let me give you an introduction to where I was at before this trip. In the weeks leading up to the trip, I started training again after top surgery. So I had top surgery on August 27th, and then I recovered for the following 5 weeks and a half, and I started training again on October 3rd. So between October 3rd and November the 8th, I had about 5 weeks of training where I built up my calories from maintenance into a caloric surplus because my main goal right now is to build muscle. And up until about a week before I left, what I knew about this trip was the following. I was going to continue working as normal. I wasn't going to take annual leave. I was going to visit my younger brother, one of my younger brothers, who's doing a semester in the US as part of his PhD program. I was going to share a room with him and a flat with 2 more people. So I would be in a room with him, and then in the rest of the flat, there would be a kitchen, a bathroom, and another bedroom for the couple. That's all I knew up until about a week before the trip. The first thing I did was I set my goals ahead of time and I did my best to keep them realistic. So with regards to training, I decided that I was going to deload during my time in New York because it wasn't a priority for me to continue training as normal. My priorities for the trip were 3. Number 1, it was to allow enough time to complete my usual workload to the high standard of service that I set for myself. Number 2 was to allow time to spend with my brother, since I haven't seen him since 2019. And I wanted to allow enough time to enjoy Manhattan, which I hadn't been to at that point in over 10 years, and I'd missed it dearly because if you listen to my episodes that I recorded on the Mayo Minds podcast, then you'll know that I spent 6 months on Long Island as an exchange student, and I used to visit Manhattan literally every single weekend, and I fell in love with New York utterly and completely back then. And the third priority was to give my body some goddamn rest after 5 weeks on a high volume, high intensity, hypertrophy oriented program. So for all these reasons, training wasn't aligned with my priorities. Therefore, I programmed a deload where I decided I wouldn't go to the gym at all. because I knew that even a single gym session or two would take up at least 2 hours or so, because I would have to commute there, I would have to get my workout done, I would need to come back and shower. And on top of working, that already takes up the vast majority of my day. And I knew that if my priority was to visit Manhattan, I would have to sacrifice the days of training uh, I would have to sacrifice visiting Manhattan on the days I wanted to train. And I decided I wasn't willing to do that. With regards to nutrition, since I wasn't going to train and therefore stimulate muscle growth, it didn't seem necessary to be in a caloric surplus. So I decided that I was going to go back to maintenance. And I made the choice to continue tracking my calories and macros throughout the experience, because I was going to have access to a full kitchen and be able to cook my own meals. So it seemed realistic and feasible for me to maintain that habit. The second step I took was to set some hard rules for myself. The most important hard rule for myself was to not undereat. So normally I give myself a 100 calorie range, for example, 1900 to 2000 calories. This time, since I was going to be in a different environment, I wanted to give myself more flexibility, and I extended this range to 200 calories. And the hard rule was not to go below the lower end of this calorie range. Your hard rules are for you to choose. For example, if you don't have the best relationship with the scale and you're afraid of gaining weight, then you may want to establish a specific amount of weight that you're okay to gain, such as, I will be okay if I come back and I've gained 2 pounds. I personally don't feel the need to do that because I see the body weight that I see on the scale as data. But a lot of my clients do still do that, and there's no shame. Everybody has different needs. Or vice versa, not vice versa, but another example would be if you have a tendency to overeat or undereat, then you want to set yourself some hard rules like the calorie range that I just gave myself, so that you prevent yourself from doing either. For instance, when I have a client who decides to keep tracking while they're away, I usually agree with them on the maximum amount of calories above which they commit not to go, even on the most pear-shaped looking day, and the minimum amount they don't want to fall below. Whereas if they're not tracking, we agree on a number of eating occasions, including meals and snacks, that they definitely want to hit, and they don't want to fall below that, but they also don't want to go above. And it's usually a range. It won't be exactly 4 meals. It might be 3 to 5 meals, but it's a pretty tight range so that we don't go into overeating or undereating by accident. The third step for me was to do some nutrition research and some food prep. So I called my brother the week before I left, and we had a 45-minute conversation where I asked him if he could make himself fully available to answer my questions, and he very graciously did. I have a great relationship with my brothers. They are absolutely awesome. I have to say that it's not related to the podcast, but I just wanted to put it out there. Anyway, we had this 45-minute conversation during which I found out, number one, exactly roughly how big the kitchen was, the kitchen utensils available, the space in the fridge and in the cupboards that I would get, the other housemates' habits regarding the kitchen. So the times when I would find it empty and the times when it would be busiest. And since my brother is a subcontractor and the couple are the main lease holder, I found out whether they had any specific rules that I should respect, since I was technically going to be the guest of somebody who wasn't even the main leaseholder. I also asked about their habits in general to get an idea of when to wake up, when to start making noise in the morning, if there was a curfew past which one shouldn't make noise. I found out when my brother typically goes to bed and wakes up, because we were going to share the same bed. I asked him if he struggled to sleep and if there's anything I could do to help him get better sleep or make sure I didn't make it any worse. I asked him about how many keys he had, and so found out that we would need to share the same key. So we would need to arrange our schedules to make sure that neither of us would get locked out. In short, I tried to cover every aspect of daily life that I could think of to make sure that I would respect everybody else's boundaries, but I also had enough data to set up my own boundaries and make sure that I could feel comfortable and make decisions that were aligned with my personal priorities. Maybe listening to this, you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot to ask of other people. But I would encourage you not to fall into the trap of deciding on behalf of other people how they're going to react to your questions and what you want to do. Because in my experience, it's not a big deal to help you with your research. My brother said from the beginning, it's really not a problem to have this call and to explain these things to you. And also, it helps you set yourself up for success so that you're going to feel less anxious, you're going to feel more satisfied because you're staying on top of your own priorities. And that's going to allow you to not only achieve your fitness goals, but to show up at your best for the people that you'll be with. And that is much better than not asking anything, not asking for any accommodations, not setting any boundaries, and then suffering for it, and for that suffering to contribute to how you show up for the people that you'll be sharing your travels with. So I strongly encourage you to communicate your needs and ask and do your research as early as possible, and to set up expectations with the people that you'll be spending your time with. Because I didn't only ask my brother questions, I also told him, look, this is what you can expect from my routine. This is when I'm planning to go to bed, when I'm planning to wake up, when I'm planning to eat. This is what I'm planning to do during the day. This is when we can spend time together. Let me know what your schedule looks like so we can make sure that we do get time to spend together. So I made sure that he knew what he could expect from me, so that there was no miscommunication or misunderstanding on either end, and we both got our needs met. And if you don't take that step of perhaps making yourself uncomfortable by asking these questions and having this conversation, you're not going to be able to predict what the other person is going to do or how you can plan for your own needs. And in my experience, that's a recipe for not necessarily disaster, but definitely some discomfort. So once I had the information that I needed, I used this data to inform my food prep. First of all, I had a direct 8-hour flight from 2 p.m. in the UK to 5 p.m. EST. So that was going to be 10 p.m. UK time. Now, neither the airport nor the flight food options were suited to my goals. So I packed my own meals for the whole day, leaving out dinner, for which I decided I was going to stop at a grocery store on my way to my brother's flat. So what I did was I decided to delay my meals to better match the new time zone, with the only exception being my first meal of the day, because I normally eat around 6 a.m. And while I'm not overtly hungry in the morning, especially if I don't train, I knew that if I delayed my first meal until, for example, 12 p.m., because that would have been more like 7 a.m. in America, going from 6 a.m. when I normally expect some food until 12 with nothing in my stomach, especially when I had to travel and I was already stressed because of that, would have been harmful to me, deleterious to my well-being. So I had a snack around 9 a.m. and then I had my first meal, which I considered to be breakfast, around 1 p.m. So that would have been 8 a.m., which was around when I was planning to have breakfast in the States. And then I had my second meal, so my, in quotes, lunch at 6 p.m. UK time on the flight. And then I had my final meal when I finally got to my destination, which was around 8 p.m. at night. And the reason why I was going to have breakfast around 8 or 9 a.m. in America was that by communicating with my brother, I found out that one, the other two housemates were going to get up around 8 a.m. And number two, my brother himself gets up around 7 or so. And so he asked me to get up at the earliest at 6:30 when I normally would get up between 5 and 6. So I agreed to that to respect his needs and wishes because he told me I sleep really badly. And if you wake up too early, that's the end of my night's sleep, basically, because he is a really light sleeper. So I set my alarm for 7 a.m. every morning, and I decided that I was going to have my first meal around 8 or 9 so that I could spend the initial 1 or 2 hours of the day when I'm not very hungry working. Anyway, going back to the plan of eating dinner once I got to my brother's flat, I planned to stop at a store, as I said, and I decided that I would already write my shopping list before I even left. And in order to do that, I first chose to have one of my go-to meals that I know help me hit my macros and calories and keep me full and satiated, and it's something I look forward to. It's a comfort meal. After a long day of traveling, I knew I was going to need that. And that for me right now is a bean salad, so about 2 to 300 grams of some beans or legumes of my choice, some vegetables that I wouldn't need to cook, a source of protein, and some sort of condiment. What I did next was I researched the closest supermarket on the way from the subway station that I was going to get to my brother's apartment. Once I found that supermarket, I looked up its stock. And if you're going to America, there's a website, which is also an app, called Instacart, which enables you to order same day pickup or delivery from a vast selection of grocery stores across the country. So I found this particular supermarket on Instacart and I could look up the stock. So I already knew if they had the beans and the vegetables and the protein source that I wanted. So I wouldn't have to look into that after an exhausting day of traveling. Another way in which you can use Instacart is for its original purpose, where you can get your food delivered to your door right after your arrival, so you don't even have to go to the grocery store yourself. I opted for going myself because after 8 hours sitting on a plane, I knew I would also be a little bit restless, and walking an extra 5 minutes and familiarizing myself with my surrounding area sounded like a good investment into my time. So once I had the shopping list written down and I'd looked up each individual product on Instacart, I also planned my dinner into my calorie and macro tracking app. And I did that first. And then I built my other meals into the calorie tracking app around that initial meal, since it was the most uncertain of the day, where I would have all new foods from an American store. And I made this plan a few days before I left, so that in the meantime I could go shopping for the food I needed for the UK-based meals. And this is what that day, the day of the flight, looked like, food-wise. I had my first meal, which was more like a snack, around 9 a.m. UK time while I was on the train, and this was a massive pot of baked apple flavor Greek yogurt. So this was 450 grams and therefore around 45 grams of protein. And the reason why I chose that specific food is that it's really, really filling for me, and I knew it would easily tide me over from 9 a.m. until 1 or 2 p.m. when I was planning on having my first fuller meal, meaning my American breakfast, so to speak, or UK time lunch. And also, it didn't require any preparation because I simply bought the pot from M&S, Marks and Spencer, and I simply ate the whole pot on the train. My first fuller meal, which was again UK time lunch, American time breakfast, was 2 wholemeal wraps filled with herb chicken slices from Lidl, and on the side, for my vegetables, a bag of cherry tomatoes that I could just eat straight out of the bag like chips. I love cherry tomatoes. This was super easy to put together. I simply microwaved the wraps to soften them. I spread the chicken herb slices, which came in a package, on top of them, folded them up, wrapped them in aluminum foil, slapped them in my bag, done. And the cherry tomatoes, they came in a bag, so all I had to do was open the bag and eat them. And I also managed to spill some tomato juice down the front of my sweater, which was just excellent because obviously I couldn't change my clothes while I was traveling. Then my second meal of the day, my UK time dinner, American time lunch, was. Oh, sorry, this was my second meal of the day. My first meal of the day, then, which was my American time breakfast, was an actual breakfast food. I made myself an oat cake in the microwave, which I put in a what's it called? A plastic container. So it was oats plus an egg plus a mashed banana, which I rescued from my partner because she buys them and then doesn't eat them when they're super ripe, but that's when they're best for baking. So I used it in my oat cake. And then I added chocolate flavored protein powder. So I microwaved the whole thing for 3 minutes. You just mash everything together, blend it with a spoon, and microwave it. And then I ate it around 1 p.m. while I was waiting to be boarded. And finally, when I got to my brother's flat, I got everything that was on my shopping list, and I made myself a bean salad with black beans and butter beans. Butter beans are my favorite beans. I got more cherry tomatoes just because they don't require any cooking, and I'm not too fast about having the same vegetables twice in a day. I knew I would have more diversity the following days. And then I had low sugar barbecue sauce, and I believe I had chicken breast that was already pre-cooked, and that I just need to add to the bowl as my protein source, in addition to the protein that I got from all the beans. In addition to that, I packed certain foods to bring to America with me. But before doing that, I asked my brother what the fitness food situation was, because now my brother has been into fitness and training for about a couple of years, which was really fun because we could have some really interesting conversations about it. Anyway, he had creatine monohydrate and he had protein powder. I didn't like his protein powder, so I packed my own, but I told him, I'm gonna borrow your creatine and never give it back. And so I got to have his creatine and didn't have to bring my own. I brought my own protein powder and I brought my own premix, chocolate pudding premix, which is essentially another powder which has a high protein content, but also has some added ingredients that makes it so when you mix it with water, it has a really thick pudding texture, so it's a little bit thicker than a Greek yogurt, and I love it. And I thought that these two foods would really serve me while I was over there. And then, in order to continue tracking my calories and macros, I also brought my food scale. And then I had this genius idea where I asked them if they had a can opener, because I was thinking to myself that I would want to have a lot of meals that were easy to make, and I use a ton of beans in meals that don't require a lot of cooking. So when I found out that they didn't in fact have a can opener, I packed my own, which is an electric can opener, which is just fantastic because you press a button and it does the whole thing in 30 seconds. It's brilliant. Anyway, this was a real genius idea only because I'm not known for my practical sense, to be honest. I'm very good at abstract thinking and planning, but when it comes to more practical aspects of life, I'm not as good, to be honest. It's something that my mother has always made fun of me for example, so I know it's been the case since I was born. And therefore, coming up with this genius idea and having my own can opener made me feel really smart. So let me have this moment to celebrate myself and pat myself on the back, dear listeners. Now, I need to stress how important this research and food prep can be. Because when you get to your destination, you'll be so busy sorting yourself out, exhausted, and maybe even jet lagged, depending on where you're going, that you won't be in the right headspace to make goal aligned food choices. How many times did you think, I'm going to figure things out when I get there. And then the way you figured things out was you ordered some easy, greasy takeout. Or maybe you went without eating because you were that exhausted. And then you woke up the next day and you wanted to eat the world. There's no shame in that. We've all done it at least once, myself included. That's why I'm telling you now, do not underestimate the importance of planning ahead. The more you can do that, the better, not only for your departure, but also for your return. That's why I normally recommend my clients to buy, prepare, and freeze at least 1 day's worth of meals for when they get back, or to rely on ready meals and freeze those if needed. Or if they're up for it, to plan for their grocery list and their meal options for the day they get back. In my case, I was going to get a red-eye flight and I would land in the UK around 7 a.m. on my day off work on a Saturday. I knew I was going to be back home just before lunchtime because I was going to get a direct train to come back from the airport, just like I did on the way to the airport. But I also knew I wasn't going to have the energy or the drive to do a major grocery run, which I do once a week, and I basically traipse around Liverpool and I hit all my favorite supermarkets all on the same day. This is what works for me. It takes me a couple of hours. It gets me all the steps I need for that day. And I knew it wasn't going to be a viable strategy on the day I got back because I was going to be too tired. So instead, I knew I was going to go to a single store and I could buy enough to last myself at least a couple of days. However, I also knew that that big grocery run I do happens at the end of a working week. So on a Friday, right before my day off, or on the Saturday itself, depending on my commitments on that particular weekend. So if I only bought a little bit of food on that Saturday, I wouldn't be able to go to do my big traipsing around Liverpool shopping trip until the next week. And for this reason, I left myself some food in the fridge that wouldn't perish until after I got back, so some protein yogurts. I also left myself some food in the freezer so that I wouldn't need to go to more than one supermarket. And finally, I set up an order to arrive 2 days after my return with Ocado, which is an online supermarket, pretty much like Instacart, but it's a supermarket rather than a database of various supermarkets, and they deliver food straight to your door in the UK. And last but not least, I gave myself an emergency option in quotation marks, where I thought, well, if I get back around lunchtime and I'm really not in a mood to make lunch, I'm gonna get myself to a restaurant and I'm gonna get a meal, which I've already planned and thought of beforehand so that I can arrange the rest of the day around it if need be. And I know it's a meal that I'm going to enjoy and a meal I'm used to so that my digestion will also fall into place. Step number 4 for me was to do some research and planning for my physical activity. So, of course, if you're going to train, you're going to want to look at accommodation that's within walking distance of a gym or accommodation with a gym in situ. So, for example, a hotel gym. And then you want to email the facility to find out if they offer day or weekly passes. If you listen to my conversation with Brandon, you already know all about this. In my case, I wasn't going to train at a gym, but I wanted to hit my usual step count and then some, to be honest, because I planned to do as much sightseeing as I possibly could. And so I planned to do all of my work in the morning. So from the time I woke up and got ready to work until the early afternoon, that's when I set up my work block, where normally at home I would spread my hours out across the day to make time for the gym and for other admin tasks and for a little bit of me time as well. In this particular case, I didn't have any other commitments, so I just committed to work the whole time with a couple of breaks for meals. And then in the afternoon until the late evening, I would be out in New York. So I planned to do everything I needed to do in terms of commuting, either on the subway or walking. And as a result of that, I easily got to 12,000 steps every day. I think my lowest step day was 12,000, and I got up to 21,000 steps. As many, or rather, I got as many as 21,000 steps, especially on the first day because it was my day off, it was Saturday. So I just did a massive walk all day. I went to Central Park, I went to the National Museum of American History. No, to the American Museum of Natural History. I'm the name of that museum continues to confuse me. It's an amazing museum. Natural history museums are my favorite, and this one was massive with a lot of fossils, which are my favorite part. Anyway, it was a uh, big day for walking, and I clocked 21,000 steps, and then my lowest day was 12,000 because I took this approach where I committed to only using the subway as my main form of public transport and walking the rest of the time. And these were the 4 steps that I took to prepare for the trip. So, in summary, step number 1 was to set my goals ahead of time and keep them realistic. Step number 2 was to set some hard rules for myself. Step number 3 was to research nutrition and do some food prep. Step number 4 was to do some research into physical activity. Now, for the second part of this podcast, I'm going to move into how I executed on this plan. First of all, none of this is easy. I've been coaching people and I've been doing this myself for years. So I may make it sound easy and like it's second nature to me, but it's actually absolutely normal for every single one of us, including myself, to find it challenging, albeit for different reasons depending on the person. So I'm going to tell you about my challenges. I love my routine, my daily habits, and my structure. Therefore, what I struggled with the most was to be thrown out of that. It was to have to share a room and to adhere to someone else's schedule rather than just my own. It was to have to reshuffle my activities so that the morning became the least active part of my day, when it's been the opposite for years. I spent years getting the majority of my steps early in the morning, train early in the morning. I feel more energetic and more active and more driven in the mornings. So I've always dedicated the mornings to working and to moving. And it was really difficult to work but not be able to move until I finished work in the early afternoon. So all these aspects of daily life that maybe for you aren't a big deal because you're a much more flexible person than I am, felt like a real departure from my comfort zone for me. And originally it gave me stress and it gave me anxiety. And it took me a couple of days of being there, immersed in that new environment, to build up a routine that I felt confident and comfortable with. I still went, I still achieved my goals, and I thoroughly enjoyed that week. But it wasn't all smooth sailing from a psychological perspective. Nevertheless, you can't grow unless you make that move and push yourself out of your comfort zone. And traveling is a great opportunity to do just that. If you prove to yourself that you can stick to your plan to the best of your abilities when you're away from home, which is arguably the most challenging time to do so because it's always easier when you're in your usual environment, then you'll come back with a lot more confidence that you can do exactly the same in that very usual environment. Obviously, you can't set exactly the same goals, which is why I've just spent the first 20 minutes on this podcast explaining how I set different goals and I made sure they were realistic. I gave myself a little bit more leeway with my calories. I gave myself some hard rules to ensure that I could hit those priorities because they were different than usual and I knew that it was going to be harder to hit them. And I also dialed them back a little. For example, I chose not to train, which arguably made everything so much easier because normally I spend at least 2 hours, 5 days a week between commuting to the gym, doing my workout, coming back and showering, which where 2 full hours I could now spend on working, visiting New York, spending time with my brother, going to the grocery store, and so on. So, having said all of this, hopefully I've given you a little bit of insight into what I personally found difficult. And now I'm going to cover how I was able to stick to the priorities that I explained I had for myself. Step number one, and possibly the most important, was communication, which I've already ranted about, but let me really nail this or hammer this home. It is daunting to navigate your fitness goals when you're traveling, especially if you're staying with other people or traveling with other people. You may worry about coming across as rude or uncaring. You may feel pressure to eat certain foods or drink alcohol, or you may be reluctant to train because it could be seen as a selfish activity when you could be spending more time with others. So, communication is where you can allay all these fears and still achieve your goals while keeping everybody comfortable with you and showing up as your best self with them. As long as you're upfront, you may be surprised to discover that your travel companions don't have a problem with your goals and what you want to do, as long as they know what to expect from you and you respect their own priorities in return. Which is why, given that I was a guest, I had to adapt to my brother and his housemates' rhythms. But at the same time, I was able to create my own rhythms in order to stick to my goals. So after the conversation we had prior to my leaving, once I got there, I proceeded to adapt, but also asked follow up questions anytime an issue arose. And once we actually had a little spat over the key issue that I've already talked about, where I misunderstood my brother when he said the time at which he would be back. And I thought it was later than he actually said. So I ended up um, getting there later than he asked me to be back, getting back to the flat later than he asked me. And he got upset about that. And I communicated very clearly to him that it had been a misunderstanding. And I asked him, next time, don't snap at me right away, perhaps. Try to give me the benefit of the doubt. You've given me a lot of information to absorb, and I'm doing my absolute best. And he understood where I was coming from, and we made up right away. So even when you try to be as upfront as possible and gather all the information that you can still make mistakes, and you will still make mistakes. Clearly, my brain turned off when my brother said, I'm going to be back at this time, and my brain registered a completely different time. And yet, we still made the most of our time together. That spat lasted all of 10 minutes on WhatsApp and 10 minutes in person. And then the rest of the time, we were best chums. So, this is to say, don't be afraid of communicating your needs and your wants. As long as you convey what you're trying, as long as you convey that you're trying to be as considerate and respectful of everybody else's needs and wants, this will set you up for success and it will leave a better impression of you on the people involved. Now, after communication, which is, in my view, probably the most important factor I want to discuss, the others are not really in any particular order. So next I'm going to cover meal frequency and cooking strategies. In order to hit my nutritional targets, I made the majority of my meals at home and I ate out twice. Normally, I would go out for food once a week when I'm in the UK. So I thought, well, twice per week is still reasonable for my own calorie budget, which isn't massive. So I need to account for that. If you have a much larger calorie budget, realistically, you may be able to fit a meal out more often than I can. But with my calorie budget, too many meals out result in me essentially not having a lot of calories left and for the rest of the day, and therefore having to save calories or borrow them from other days, which is fine if I only have 1 or 2 meals out. But if I start having one every day, that can really be detrimental because I'll have to go hungry essentially, which is not ideal and it's not something I want to do. I want to fuel myself well for the entire day. I am not in the habit of starving myself, so to speak, to use a hyperbole, for a single meal. And I encourage my clients and you, dear listener, not to do it either, because it's not worth it and it doesn't set you up for a healthy relationship with food. In addition to that, when I did eat out, I only chose a less health promoting and higher calorie meal once. And then I made all of my other meals at home. So this strategy ensured I could meet my protein and fiber targets without overeating, and that I could feel my best every day by keeping a wholesome diet. But I didn't want to dedicate as much time to cooking as I do at home. So I reduced my eating frequency. Normally at home, I have 4 eating occasions: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack. And I brought this frequency down to 3. So I skipped the snack and I had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So I had more time to work in the morning and therefore more time to explore New York later in the day and stay with my brother, spend time with him. And in addition to that, this wasn't a difficult change to implement because my snack is usually in the morning, since I have my first meal, breakfast, then I train, and then I have that snack to support my training with energy before and after, as well as protein before and after. But since I wasn't training, I'm not usually all that hungry when I wake up, and I can easily go a few hours without food. So for me, this was absolutely sustainable. And last but not least, if I have one fewer meal, well, that meant I had more calories available for the other 3. And given that I wasn't in my typical environment, and as I've said, things could go a little bit pear-shaped for whatever reason, and I may find myself having to eat foods I hadn't planned for, or under other challenging circumstances, then I wanted to ensure that I had a little bit of an extra budget and flexibility with regards to my calories. And since I was sharing a very small kitchen with 3 other people, and I didn't want to spend too long on making a meal, I stuck to simple but health promoting recipes that would require little to no cooking, and at least one of my meals, and usually 2, was the exact same every day. For example, my dinner was always a bean salad. As I said before, I just mixed together 300 grams of usually 2 varieties of bean. I added 60 to 80 grams of a low-calorie barbecue sauce, which is my favorite condiment. I added a protein source of choice, which was usually pre-cooked chicken or pre-boiled eggs, so that, again, I would only need the microwave to make this whole meal. And then I had super easy vegetables that I didn't need to cook. So I just got fresh cherry tomatoes and I washed them, and that was my meal prepared. I love cherry tomatoes and I don't mind them fresh rather than cooked. Whereas my breakfast, the first couple of days, was always 45 grams of rolled oats with 90 mils of liquid egg whites, which I microwaved for 3 minutes so they coalesce together into an oat cake. And then I topped that oat cake with 300 grams of 0% fat Greek yogurt, 15 grams of Jello sugar-free cheesecake pudding, which is amazing, mixed with the Greek yogurt, and 150 grams of fresh or frozen blueberries. And then once I ran out of the yogurt, I actually switched to egg white wraps, which are incredible, and I am trying my hardest to smuggle them from America to the UK because I had my sights set on them for ages because they're not available in the UK, but I knew about them, about their availability in America. I tried them and I thought they were great. 25 to 30 calories each and 5 grams of protein. And I'm not saying they're great because they taste great. They taste plain. I mean, they taste like egg white. But I found that they really enhance the taste of whatever you put in them. So I added peanut butter and my chocolate flavored pudding, which I brought from the UK together with my protein powder. Anyway, it was an amazing breakfast, and then I added the blueberries again to that too, which I already missed, to be honest. But again, the point is I was keeping these 2 meals exactly the same every single day, and one night I ate out, so I had the bean salad for lunch instead of dinner. But the point is I wanted to be quick at planning my meals, be quick at making my meals, and make sure that my meals met my goals without having to spend too much time or bandwidth on them. Then the next factor I want to talk about is training and movement. So, as originally planned, this was my deload week. I didn't go to the gym, and I wanted to make the most of my relatively limited time in probably my favorite city in the world to this day, which is New York. The additional challenge was that I didn't have my walking pad, which I normally use to complete the majority of my steps in the morning before lunchtime. So, as I said, this was probably the thing I struggled with the most. I literally found myself tapping my foot on the floor while I was working, way more than I normally do. It was almost like I got restless leg syndrome. And this is a hyperbole, it's a joke. I don't mean to make fun of people with this condition, but it's what it felt like, because I was getting so restless. I really was not used to not doing my steps in the morning, but I hunkered down, focused on my work, and then committed to being as productive as I needed to be so that I could have time to do sightseeing once the workday was over. I was aiming to get at least my usual 12,000 steps per day as an average across the week. So I thought, if I want to visit something that takes a while to get to, and I need to spend a lot of time on the subway, and I end up doing 8,000 steps, I'm not going to beat myself up for that, because I'll have other higher step days, and I'll make sure that the average is at least 12,000 steps. At the end of the day, as I said, I didn't really need to worry about it. I ended up clocking at least 12,000 steps per day without much effort, and on a couple of days I went over 20,000. But still, had I not done all of the research that I talked about in the beginning, this would have been much more of a toss-up. The point of this entire episode, and the two before this one, is that if you wing it, you may still achieve your goals, but it's a toss-up whether you do or not. And I don't like anything to happen to myself or to my clients. I like to be intentional with every decision I make, because I strongly believe that it's when you're intentional that you feel empowered by the choices you make. If you're not intentional and you still end up achieving your goals, you feel a sense of relief because you were afraid of failing. Whereas if you're intentional, you feel a sense of pride and you build confidence in yourself. Whereas if you wing it and you fail, in quotation marks, then you feel shame. Whereas if things go pear-shaped, when you're being intentional, you can at least ask yourself, did I do everything in my power to make this go my way? And was what happened within my control? And if it wasn't, and you did do your absolute best, you can live with that and move on much more easily than if you said, oh, well, I winged it and it didn't go to plan. Well, no shit, because there was no plan. That's why I really want the one thing that you take away from this podcast to be that the more you plan and the more you try to be intentional and do your absolute best, the better off you will be, at least psychologically. Even if things don't always go as you would have wanted them to, there's a greater chance that they will, and you will feel more empowered, more in control, and this will make it easier to go straight back into your usual fitness routine when you come back, because you've built up more confidence and you've collected some wins even while you were away. You're not coming back and thinking, well, now I'm back to square one, or I really need to work up the motivation to do this, to get back into fitness again, because everything went pear-shaped while I was away. And now the final factor that I want to cover is body image. My goals for this trip had nothing to do with the way that I look. So I focused on moving and eating in order to feel good and maintain my healthy habits. So again, it would be easier to get back into my routine once I got back. I didn't focus on these aspects to look a certain way. This means that I chose not to engage in body checking behaviors because they were not relevant to my goals. So I didn't weigh myself on a scale, I didn't look at myself in the mirror when I was naked, and I also didn't take naked pictures or half-naked pictures of myself as I normally do every week to accumulate data to check on my progress towards my bodybuilding goals. I'm not saying that these tools are harmful. I'm saying that if they're not relevant to the goal, why use them? They're only going to distract you from the actual priority that you set for yourself. Besides, by adopting healthy nutrition and movement habits, you are going to maintain a similar body composition and a similar physique to when you left. So, focusing on your actions as opposed to your looks will still benefit your body composition and physique, but it will not take the same psychological toll on you than if you worry too much about your appearance every single day, which would also take away from your travels. Finally, I accepted that due to traveling, I would get constipated and therefore a bit more bloated than I usually would. This is a phenomenon called shy bowel in not very scientific terms, and it's been affecting me since I was a small child. So it happened and it came as no surprise. But I could have stressed a lot more about it, given that I spent a whole year between 2022 and 2023 in a lot of pain because of chronic constipation. However, I made a very conscious effort to stress as little about it as I could. And as a result of that, my digestive discomfort lasted a very short time, and I was already much more regular by the second morning of my stay. And thanks to trying to stay positive about it and maintaining my fitness routine, I truly believe this is what helped my digestion get better, get back to normal as quickly as possible. And that's how I was able to execute the plan to the best of my abilities. I wasn't perfect. I achieved all of the goals that I set for myself in terms of nutrition and movement. That is true. But from a psychological perspective, I was stressed and I was anxious at various points. And that did take a little bit away from my stay. And it's something that I personally have been working on for years and will continue to work on in the years to come. My personal issue has never been not meeting my movement and nutrition goals. If anything, my problem is that I focus so much on achieving them at the expense of my own mental well-being. This is what was happening when I had an eating disorder. And that eating disorder, that way of thinking is what precipitated the eating disorder. The eating disorder didn't create that way of thinking. So it's still something I contend with on a regular basis. But I'm happy to say that this was one of the trips during which I was the least stressed and during which I was able to have the most fun while sticking to my goals. So I proved to myself that I can be flexible, that I don't need to be single-minded about training and nutrition in order to achieve my goals. I can definitely achieve them even when I let loose a little bit, as I did this time. And I also proved to myself that compared to years ago when I was struggling with an eating disorder, but even only 2 years ago when I did no longer had an eating disorder, I made progress in my attempt to become more flexible with my nutrition and training lifestyle. So on the whole, I really want to clarify that I wasn't perfect, because I don't want you to think that that's the case, because nobody's perfect and perfection is not required to achieve your goals. But I also wanted to be honest about what that lack of perfection means for me, because the average person may more likely struggle to achieve their goals, whereas I struggle with being too focused on them. So if this resonates with you, I feel you. It's hard when your brain works against you like that and makes you such a stressy type A person. And if you cannot relate to this because you struggle more with staying consistent with your goals, then hopefully this helped you get a little bit more of my perspective, so that you don't leave this podcast wondering to yourself, why did he say he wasn't perfect if he achieved all his goals? I really try to be as authentic as I possibly can on this podcast, even though admittedly it's really hard for me to share what I struggle with. But we all struggle with something, and the more I share it, the less of a big deal it becomes in my own head and the easier it is to overcome it. In any case, I now want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the aftermath of the trip. So once I got back on Saturday morning, I knew that flying and traveling in general can cause some digestive changes and some fluid fluctuations. So I didn't weigh myself until the next day, and I knew that that next day weigh-in would likely still be quite high from traveling. So I didn't freak out. I just took it as data, as I said before. I didn't need to weigh myself or look at myself in the mirror to ascertain whether I'd stuck with my goals or not. I already knew that because I was focused on my behaviors over my look or weight. Therefore, the reason I weighed myself wasn't that I needed reassurance or I was desperate to find out that everything was, in quotation marks, all right. It was that I wanted some data. I like to know how my body responds to extraordinary situations. I pretty much know at this point what my fluctuations look like on a day-to-day basis. And I've collected a lot of data on how they can change when I have a really high sodium meal or a meal out at night the night before, or if I travel and I come back on a red-eye flight, because I've collected these weigh-ins over the years. So to me, this was simply yet another piece of data to learn how my body would respond to, one, a red-eye flight, but two, a meal out, because when I landed the next day, in the end, I did have lunch out. As I said, was my emergency plan. And so I wanted to see what the combination of those two factors would look like on the scale. So I'm not saying you cannot weigh yourself the next day if you so choose, because if you do it for the sake of collecting data like I did, that's absolutely fine. I do encourage you simply to check in with you about your intentions, because if you're doing it out of a desire or a need to know that you didn't gain weight or that you didn't lose weight, then you may not be focusing enough on your behaviors, and you may have a relationship with the scale that you want to work on. So, in summary, if you want to execute the plan that I spent part one of this episode talking about, you want to communicate your needs and wants as soon as and as clearly as you can. You want to give yourself extra flexibility around nutrition and keep things simple to give yourself the best chances of accomplishing your goals. You want to keep the eating of highly palatable, high-calorie foods to a minimum, because it's very possible to make calorie-friendly choices when you're eating out if you're willing to do some research into restaurants and to ask for meal customizations. Don't fall into the trap of feeling deflated and like you have to have a really high-calorie meal because you can't customize your meal or you only have access to certain restaurants. There are so many options to eat a healthy meal now at a restaurant. You only need to commit to the research. Then you want to stay active, even if you choose not to follow your typical training program. And you want to focus on your actions over focusing on your looks or your weight. And with that, I've been talking about this trip for a whole hour. Again, I'm always impressed at my ability to talk to myself for this long. And I hope that what I shared with you was valuable and that you can take away some important lessons, some practical lessons to apply to your own future trips, especially given the time of year that we're going into. We're getting closer and closer to the winter holidays. On that note, a lot of people may delay working on their fitness goals until the start of the following year, around this time of year. They're thinking, well, there's Thanksgiving, there's Christmas, there's New Year, so I'll get into a fitness routine come January. But the clients that have been most successful with turning their lives around as a New Year's resolution started with me around this time of year. There is no best time to start working on your fitness, and if you really want a lifestyle change to happen in 2025, you want to lay the foundation as soon as you can. So there is still time. I am still taking on clients, so I strongly encourage you to inquire for coaching by filling out the application linked in the show notes. I really look forward to hearing from you and to work with you towards changing your lifestyle, whether you want to build muscle, lose fat, or a little bit of both. With that, thank you very much for listening, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.